So let's start big, kind of the historical constitutional perspective. Andy, I know that you love to geek out about this stuff.
If we could, I'd like to start with when you joined the campaign. You said that one of the things that you wanted to do was to call a constitutional convention. And so I'd actually like to turn it around a little bit and ask you about that and what your thoughts on it were from there. And then I'll sort of explain how we got to this coming from that.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I just think that while both of us and many people that we care about and respect have been involved with city, local, state, and federal advocacy efforts for legislation or regulation, that is important work. That's meaningful work. We've had some successes there. We've also had some losses there. That isn't the only way that a democracy works. That a more direct form of democracy through a constitutional convention is pretty closely tied to awakening people's political imaginations and having people realize it doesn't have to be this way, right? The rules of the game, the rules of the political system were not written in stone and handed down or are part of, natural science. The way things are, right? These are rules that we wrote for ourselves, and more powerful people had a stronger hand in the writing of those rules. But that if we organize and we build our own power, and then we call a state constitutional convention, that we can rewrite the rules of the political game in Maryland, and that there are some things uniquely suited about the way constitutional conventions work and the timing in Maryland that make that goal, while we obviously need constitutional reform at the federal level, but make that goal at the state level of constitutional change possible and attainable. So I think there's, on the one hand, this really, amazing, broad, rethink all of politics at the state level opportunity. And then there's also, hey, this is more attainable than I even realized. Once I started talking to smart people about how the constitutional conventions in Maryland are supposed to work.
Yeah. And so I remember you came to me and you were like, I want to abolish the office of lieutenant governor and I want to call a constitutional convention. And sometimes I wish for those simple days when that was all we had to focus on and talk about. But at that point, we started digging into how constitutional conventions work in Maryland. And what we found was that the Maryland Constitution actually sets up a provision that every 20 years, the voters get asked if they want to have a constitutional convention. It's been in the Constitution since 1864. It survived in the 1867 version of the Constitution, that every 20 years, the voters would be asked on the ballot whether they wanted to have a constitutional convention. Well, when I started to look into that, what I found was that the way that it is structured is that the constitutional provision for how a constitutional convention gets called is not the majority of the votes that voted on the question. It is some wonky wording that says the majority of the votes that voted in the election. And I was like, what does that mean? I was trying to process what that meant. So I went and I looked, and in 2010, what ends up happening is that you get 54.4% of the people who voted on the Constitutional Convention voted for it. But like 200,000 people didn't vote. And so it had numbers that didn't make sense. I was looking at these numbers and it was like, it didn't make sense to me at first. And what I realized was happening is that the way the Constitution is written, it counts the blank votes as de facto no votes. And that is not the way that we vote on anything else in Maryland. It's a weird, wonky way of voting, and it is different than how we vote on anything else in Maryland. And if a constitutional convention passed a constitutional amendment, it would go to the voters, and it would be judged on the number of votes on the question. So the difference here is that a normal election or a constitutional amendment is judged on the number of votes on the question.
And those amendments come from the legislature, right?
Right.
So when the politicians in Annapolis want to change the Constitution, there's one set of math and one set of rules. And when we want to call a constitutional convention, there's another set of math and another set of rules.
Right, exactly. And so people typically vote less on down ballot questions, on questions they don't know, they don't care, whatever. So what should happen is if somebody doesn't vote on a question, it shouldn't count for yes or for no. It should just count as abstaining. That's a choice, right? It's, but what does happen is it de facto counts to no. So whatever the case is, what you need to know is that in 2010, 54.4% of the people who voted for the Constitutional Convention, 54.4% of the people voted yes for the Constitutional Convention of the people who voted on the question. We didn't have a Constitutional Convention in 2010 because of this provision in the law, right? So we started talking about this. We had a happy hour with the Forward Party, and that happy hour with the Forward Party led us to a conversation with Republican Delegate Hornberger from Cecil County. And Delegate Hornberger and I worked together with some folks from Forward Party and some other things in order to put together a piece of legislation that simply fixes this and says that a majority of people who vote on the question carry the day, basically, right? How we're used to voting. Delegate Hornberger went and got Vaughn Stewart, who is a DSA endorsed candidate in the past and a Democrat from Montgomery County. And they are co-sponsoring a piece of legislation called HB 979, which is a constitutional amendment that would fix this, that would make it so if the majority of people voted on it, the convention was called. And so a convention could address a lot of things. It could address how we draw districts. It could talk about independence. It could talk about public power. It could talk about how we vote. It could talk about how seats are allocated. It could talk about how taxes work. It could talk about all of the things. A lot of things. It could make education and housing a human right. There's a lot of stuff that we could do and organize around if we were able to have this constitutional convention. So the next automatic question on this is 2030. So while we hope that this bill gets passed this year and gets on the ballot this year, and I'll say this, like a constitutional convention that is a constitutional amendment that is passed by the General Assembly has to go to the voters. So this bill, if it passed the General Assembly, it would go to the voters. So we hope
we've got a bill, a Republican and a Democrat with support from the Greens and Forward Party. And all we're asking the members of the House of Delegates and the State Senate to do is let voters decide with a simple majority if they want this change to our Constitution.
Yep. Pretty simple, right? Pretty straightforward. And it seems like common sense reform. Now, we'll see what happens with it. But the most powerful reform tool in Maryland's Constitution is broken because it was written in 1864 when people were afraid, when a lot of white Maryland elected leaders were afraid that Black folks were going to get the vote in the near future. And so we have a relic of the 1860s in our Constitution right now that is making it hard for Marylanders to engage in reform of the most powerful tool that we have in the state of Maryland. And so we hope HB 979 passes this year. I'll be totally honest. I think that this is the first year to introduce the concept and to start organizing around it. But in 2028, there will be another election, another opportunity for voters to weigh in on a constitutional amendment. And we hope that either this year or in 2028, this question is on the ballot for voters across the state of Maryland so that in 2030, when we get the call for whether we want to have another constitutional convention or not, if 54% of people vote yes on that question, we have a constitutional convention.
Yeah. And as you reminded me, when I got involved with the campaign, it was constitutional convention and abolish the lieutenant governor position. And that is a constitutional office, right? So we would need to do that through probably a constitutional convention, right? Because the legislature is not going to do it. So both of these early goals of the nascent Silverman Andrews for lieutenant governor platform could be addressed through this bill.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm excited about it. Like, I love the fact that this is a multi-partisan bill, that we have a Republican, a DSA Democrat, you know, like, what do a Republican and a DSA Democrat agree on? Well, maybe more than you think. And in a world in which we had a multi-party system, we would see alliances like that forming more often. And that is part of why we need to do this, because it encourages alliances across party lines. It encourages new coalitions, and it encourages shifting coalitions. And that is what it will take to change the corporate control that we have right now, is shifting coalitions of people who are working in order to do things that are better for the voters and for the ratepayers and the people.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a great opportunity. I can imagine libertarians being excited about this. In a way, this is not an explicitly ideological question. It's an insider versus outsider, right? If you already have power in Annapolis because you're Exelon and you have an army of lobbyists, for example, you're not going to like a constitutional convention as much because it's less predictable and you're doing just fine in the current system. But again, if folks want to write their delegates or their state senators, it's HB 979, right?
Yep, it's HB 979, and it's going to the Rules and Executive Nominations Committee. It doesn't have a hearing date yet. So if you believe that your vote, yes, for a constitutional convention should carry a yes vote without an extra barrier added by people in the 1860s, then you should contact your delegates and senators and representatives and tell them that you want HB 979 to get a hearing, to get a vote, and for them to vote on it.